Laura Penn thought $10 million was enough to save her family. The contract was on the table, the lawyer's pen already extended, and somewhere behind her, a 4-year-old girl was gripping a teddy bear like it was the only solid thing left in the room. She thought she understood the deal. Marry a stranger on paper, save her family, walk away in 12 months richer and untouched. She was wrong, because the man standing at the window wasn't looking at her like a business partner. He was looking at her like she was the last thing standing between his daughter and the people circling her. And the silent little girl behind him, the one who hadn't said a word in 2 years, already knew something Laura didn't. She wasn't being hired to play a wife. She was being hired to survive what was coming. Before you keep listening, do me a quick favor. If you're getting hooked on this story, tap that like button. And if you want more stories that'll have you on the edge of your seat, hit subscribe. Trust me, you won't regret it. Now, back to Laura, because the moment she signs her name, there's no walking away from what's about to happen in that penthouse. Laura Penn had read the number so many times it had stopped looking like money and started looking like a typo. $10 million. Printed in bold block letters across the cover sheet of a contract thick enough to stop a door. She sat very still in the leather chair, both hands flat on the desk in front of her, because if she lifted them, she was fairly sure they would shake. The lawyer sitting across from her had not blinked in what felt like several minutes. She was elegant in the particular way that money makes people elegant when they've had it long enough to stop trying. Chin-length bob, not a hair out of place, a black blazer tailored so precisely it looked less like clothing and more like architecture. Her name was Min-hee Cho, and she had introduced herself exactly once, in the clipped, unhurried tone of someone who did not waste syllables on people she considered temporary. "You don't have to read every page," Min-hee said, sliding a pen across the table with 2 fingers, the way you'd slide something toward an animal you didn't entirely trust. "But you should read enough to understand what you're agreeing to." Laura looked up, past Min-hee's shoulder, past the floor-to-ceiling glass that turned the entire west wall of the office into a sheet of darkening sky, soul spread out beneath them in 1,000 small fires of light. And standing in front of all of it, utterly still, was the reason she was here. Shankell didn't look at the contract. He looked at her. She'd seen pictures of him. You couldn't run a company the size of Cal Holdings and stay out of the financial press entirely, no matter how hard you tried, and he had clearly tried very hard. But pictures hadn't prepared her for the way he occupied space. He wasn't relaxed. He wasn't performing ease the way wealthy men so often did, all loose shoulders and lazy confidence, because they'd never had to be afraid of anything in a room. He stood like a man bracing for impact, like the glass behind him might shatter at any second, and he needed to already be in position to catch something falling. Beside him, half hidden in the fabric of his trousers, stood a little girl. 4, maybe 5. She had her father's stillness and none of his height, and she was looking at Laura with the kind of open, assessing stare that children gave before they'd learned to disguise it. In her arms, clutched so tightly the seams strained, was a brown teddy bear missing one button eye. Nobody had introduced the girl. Nobody had explained why a child was standing in a corporate boardroom at 7 in the evening, watching a stranger sign away a year of her life. $10 million, Laura said, mostly to hear herself say it out loud, to see if it sounded any less impossible spoken than it did printed. For a marriage that isn't a marriage. For a legal arrangement, Min-hee corrected smoothly. That will appear, to every outside party, to be a marriage. The distinction matters enormously to the people who will be reading this contract. It should not matter to you. And if I say no? Min-hee's expression didn't move, but something in the room did. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the man at the window, like a held breath being held tighter. Then we thank you for your time, and we find someone else. There's no shortage of people who need $10 million, Miss Penn. There is, apparently, a shortage of people Mr. Cal trusts. That was the part that didn't fit. If this was purely business, a board satisfied by a marriage certificate, a tax structure, an inheritance clause, whatever cold mechanism the ultra-rich used marriage for, then trust shouldn't have entered into it at all. You didn't need to trust a notarized signature. You needed a notary. Laura looked at the girl again. The girl looked back, solemn as a held note. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone 3 days ago, flattened by exhaustion into something almost unrecognizable, explaining that the hospital had stopped accepting promises and started accepting collections calls. She thought of her brother's tuition letter, the second warning, the word withdrawal, typed in a font that was probably meant to look gentle and didn't. She thought of the apartment they were 2 months from losing and the particular, specific shame of being 26 years old and still unable to fix the one thing that mattered. $10 million didn't just save her family. It ended the emergency. Permanently. What happens to her? Laura asked, nodding toward the girl, before she'd fully decided to ask it. If I sign this, what does it actually mean for her? Something flickered behind Chantal's eyes. It was there and gone so fast, she almost doubted she'd seen it. But for 1/2 second the guarded king at the window looked like a man who'd been asked a question nobody had thought to ask in a very long time. It means, he said, his first words to her, low, accented, careful, like each one cost him something, that she has someone in the apartment who isn't being paid to watch her. Minhee's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Cal, the contract speaks for itself. The contract, Chantal said, not looking away from Laura, does not speak for anything. It is 20 pages telling everyone else's story. It has nothing to do with what happens inside the apartment. Laura felt something shift under her ribs. Not trust, not yet, but the first small crack in the version of this story she'd walked in believing. She had pictured this as transactional and bloodless. A billionaire needing a wife-shaped person to wave at shareholders, a paycheck large enough to make the indignity worth swallowing. She had not pictured a child clutching a one-eyed bear like the last stable object in the universe, or a father standing like a man already losing a fight no one else in the room could see. I need to know what I'm protecting, Laura said. Not what I'm signing. What I'm actually protecting. Minnie's pen tapped once against the desk, a small, irritated metronome. That's not information available to a candidate before signature, Miss Penn. It's a security matter. Then I want it in writing that I'll be told after. For the first time, Chantal almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it touched the corner of his mouth, brief as a struck match. Add the clause, he said. Minhee looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Laura registered it, filed it away without quite knowing why it mattered yet, and then picked up a second pen, made a small notation in the margin, and turned the contract a final quarter turn toward Laura. Sign here, she said. And here. And initial every page after that. Laura picked up the pen. It was heavier than a pen had any right to be. Cool metal, the kind of object that existed purely to make a moment feel ceremonial. She thought about her mother. She thought about the hospital bills stacked like a losing hand of cards. She thought about the fact that whatever this was, whatever she was about to become a part of, she could not afford, in every sense of the word, to walk away from it. She signed. The room didn't change. No alarm went off. No triumphant music. Nothing announced itself as a point of no return. But across the desk, Minhee's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. And at the window, Chantal exhaled. One long breath, like a man who'd been holding his shoulders up around his ears for days and had only just now allowed them to drop an inch. The little girl tugged once on her father's trouser leg. He looked down at her, and for that single moment his entire face changed, softened into something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with boardrooms or contracts. And he said something to her in Korean, too quiet for Laura to catch the words, though she understood the tone. Reassurance. The universal language of "it's going to be okay," spoken by someone who didn't fully believe it himself yet. Welcome to the family, Miss Penn, Minhee said, sliding a second folder across the desk, flight information, an address, a date. Mrs. Cal. The title landed strangely. Laura turned it over once in her mind, testing its weight, and found it fit nowhere at all. The flight to Seoul felt like falling in slow motion. Laura spent most of it staring out the window at clouds that looked like frozen smoke, running the math over and over. 1 year, $10 million, divided by 365 days, divided again by every hour she would spend pretending to be something she wasn't. It should have felt like a fortune. Instead, it felt like a sentence. Not a marriage, a sentence, the kind handed down by a judge, except she'd agreed to hers willingly, and there was no appeal. A black car met her at Incheon, driven by a man who introduced himself only as security and said almost nothing else for the entire drive. The city unrolled past the tinted windows in layers, neon and glass and impossible verticality, a place that seemed built to remind anyone passing through exactly how small they were. By the time they reached the building, full dark had fallen, and the tower in front of her was less a building than a statement. 70 floors of black glass climbing into a sky it seemed determined to puncture. The elevator required a key card, a fingerprint, and, disconcertingly, a retinal scan that the driver performed on her behalf with a small handheld device, apologizing in clipped English for the inconvenience as he did it. "Security protocol," he said. "Mr. Cal's residence." "Very strict." "How strict?" Laura asked, only half joking. He didn't answer, which she decided was an answer. The penthouse, when the elevator finally opened directly into it, was enormous and almost entirely silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped 2 full sides of the space, looking out over the lit sprawl of the city like the view from the boardroom, except larger, except closer to the sky. The furniture was expensive in the understated way that only truly expensive furniture managed. No logos, no ostentation, just the quiet confidence of things that cost more than most people's cars and didn't need to announce it. And it was empty, not unoccupied. She could feel, in some animal part of her brain, that people lived here, but empty in the way a museum after closing is empty. Curated, held at a careful distance from itself. "Mr. Cal is in a call," said the woman who met her at the elevator, introducing herself as Ji-yun, the household manager, in brisk, efficient English. "He asked that I show you to your rooms. Dinner will be brought up if you'd like it, or you're welcome to the kitchen." "Where's?" Laura hesitated, realizing she didn't actually know the daughter's name. No one had told her. She'd signed a year of her life away to protect a child whose name she did not know. The little girl. Where is she? Something crossed Ji-yun's face. Quick, careful, professionally smoothed over almost before it registered. Era is with her tutor. She keeps to a schedule. "Can I meet her?" "Tomorrow, perhaps." Ji-yun's tone made it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. She doesn't adjust well to new people. It's best done slowly. Laura's rooms, and they were rooms, plural, an entire wing of the penthouse apparently allotted to her, were beautiful and impersonal in equal measure, like a 5-star hotel suite that had been told to also be a home and hadn't quite managed the transition. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed for a long time after Ji-yun left, listening to the building's strange silence, the hum of climate control, the occasional distant murmur of a voice she couldn't place. She didn't see Sean Callaghan that night. She heard him, once, past midnight, the low cadence of him speaking Korean into a phone somewhere down the hall, tense and controlled, the kind of voice that belonged to someone choosing every word like it might be used against him later. She lay awake listening to the rhythm of it without understanding a single syllable, and thought, he sounds like a man at war. In the morning, she found the kitchen, vast, gleaming, criminally underused, and Ji-yun already there, organizing what looked like a week's worth of meal schedules onto a tablet with military precision. "Where does he eat?" Laura asked, gesturing at the kitchen that clearly fed nobody. "Mr. Cal eats at his desk. Or doesn't eat." Ji-yun said this with the flat effect of someone repeating a fact she'd stopped being troubled by years ago. "Era eats in the nursery with her tutor or with security present. It's the arrangement." "That doesn't sound like an arrangement. That sounds like 2 people living in the same building and never being in the same room." Ji-yun's hand stilled on the tablet for just a second. "You'll find," she said carefully, "that this house runs on rules that don't always make sense from the outside. I'd encourage you not to ask why too loudly, too soon." Laura had spent her whole life being told not to ask why too loudly. She'd never once found that advice useful. She spent the first 3 days the way someone might spend the early days of an illness. adjusting, cataloging symptoms, learning the shape of the thing she'd signed up for. She learned that the building had 3 separate security checkpoints between the lobby and the penthouse elevator, and that the guards rotated on a schedule designed, she was fairly sure, to prevent any single one of them from learning the household's patterns too well. She learned that Sean Cal left before 6 most mornings and returned well after Laura had eaten dinner alone, that he moved through his own home like a man trying not to leave footprints in it, that his office door stayed locked even when he wasn't behind it. She learned that Era's nursery occupied the far end of the penthouse, behind 2 doors instead of 1, with a security guard posted in the hallway between them around the clock, a guard who watched a 4-year-old with the same flat vigilance you'd expect outside a vault. She did not, in 3 days, manage to actually speak to the girl. She caught glimpses, a small shape disappearing around a corner, the sound of a tutor's voice reciting English vocabulary through a half-open door. Once, briefly, the back of a small dark head bent over a coloring book at a table flanked on either side by adults whose entire job appeared to be watching her color. It was, Laura thought, the loneliest house she had ever stood inside of. Money had built every inch of it, and money had failed, completely, to make it feel like anyone lived there at all. On the 4th night, she finally crossed paths with Sean Cal in the kitchen at nearly 11. Both of them apparently driven there by the same restless inability to sleep. He startled, actually startled, a small flinch quickly suppressed, when he found her already standing at the counter, and for one unguarded second, she saw something genuinely vulnerable cross his face before the composure slid back into place like a visor. "You're awake," he said, which was not really a sentence so much as an observation made out loud because silence had become unbearable. "So are you." He moved to the far counter, putting more distance between them than the kitchen strictly required, and poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink. "I apologize for the adjustment period. The house is not used to additions." "The house," Laura repeated. "Not you." "The house," he said again, and this time there was the faintest, almost involuntary curve at the corner of his mouth, "has very particular habits. I am only its most stubborn habit." It was, she would think later, the closest thing to a joke he'd made since she'd arrived, and it landed strangely, funny and sad in the same breath, a man making light of his own isolation because the alternative was acknowledging it directly. "Your daughter doesn't know who I am," Laura said. "Nobody's told her anything. I've been here 4 days and I haven't said one word to her." Something in his posture changed, not defensive, exactly, but braced, the way she imagined he braced for every conversation that touched anywhere near the subject of his daughter. "It's intentional. She needs time." "Time to what?" "To trust that you're not going to disappear." He said it simply, without drama, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd dressed it up. "Everyone in her life who isn't paid to be here has, eventually, disappeared." Laura didn't ask what he meant by that. Not yet, not directly. But she heard the shape of the thing underneath it, the outline of a grief he clearly had no intention of handing to a stranger 4 days into a year-long arrangement. She filed it away the same way she'd filed away Minhee's strange hesitation in the boardroom. Small pieces. She was starting to collect them without quite knowing what picture they'd eventually form. "I didn't sign up to be a stranger in a house full of locked doors," she said. "If I'm supposed to be her mother on paper, I'd at least like to be a person to her in real life." He looked at her for a long moment, in the dim kitchen light, with an intensity that had nothing performative in it at all. The look, she thought, of a man recalculating something he'd assumed was already settled. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "I'll have Ji-Yun bring her to breakfast. No tutor, no guard in the room." A pause, like the next part cost him more than the rest combined. "Please don't expect her to speak. She doesn't much. Not since her mother." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Laura understood, watching the careful way he set his water glass down, untouched, and walked back toward the dark hallway, that she had just been handed the edge of something far larger than a contract, and that she had absolutely no idea, yet, how deep it went. Breakfast the next morning was, by any reasonable measure, a disaster, and also, Laura would think later, the first real thing that had happened to her since she'd landed in this glass and silence. Era arrived in Ji-Yun's grip, half a step behind, towed rather than walking, her small face arranged into the careful blankness of a child who had learned that showing fear only invited more attention to it. She wore a soft, pale sweater and carried the same battered brown bear she'd had in the boardroom, its remaining button eye-catching the morning light. She did not look at Laura. She looked, with great deliberation, at the exact center of the table, as if Laura were a hazard best avoided by maintaining a fixed gaze elsewhere. "Good morning," Laura said, keeping her voice light, unhurried, the way you'd talk to a spooked animal. "I like your bear." "Nothing." Era climbed into her chair without assistance, set the bear carefully in her lap, and reached for her spoon with the focused intensity of someone defusing something. Ji-Yun hovered near the doorway, clearly torn between leaving as instructed and the years-deep habit of not leaving. Laura caught her eye and gave a small nod. "Go. It's fine." And after a long beat, Ji-Yun went. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Laura ate. Era ate, mechanically, eyes fixed somewhere just past Laura's shoulder. The silence had a texture to it, dense and practiced. The silence of someone who had turned not speaking into an entire skill set. Laura didn't fill it with chatter. She'd worked enough odd jobs in her early 20s, daycare assistant, 2 summers, before the money ran out and she'd had to take something that paid better, to remember the cardinal rule of frightened children. They could smell desperation to be liked, and it made them retreat faster. So she ate her breakfast and said nothing at all for a while, and only when Era's shoulders had visibly loosened a fraction did she speak again, quietly, almost to herself. "This bear looks like he's been on a lot of adventures." Era's eyes flicked, briefly, involuntarily, to the bear in her lap. It was the first reaction Laura had gotten in days that wasn't avoidance. "I had a stuffed rabbit when I was your age," Laura went on, still not looking directly at her, keeping her own gaze on her plate, giving the girl room to watch without being watched. "Mr. Wiggles. Terrible name. I picked it when I was 3, so." She shrugged. "He lost an ear in the wash once. I cried for 2 days. My mom had to sew it back on with thread that didn't even match, and I loved him more after that, somehow. Like the stitches made him more mine." Era said nothing, but she had stopped eating, spoon hovering, watching Laura now with an attention so total it felt almost physical. "Your bear's missing an eye," Laura said. "That's a good sign, actually. Means he's loved enough to get hurt and stick around anyway." It wasn't much. It wasn't a breakthrough, not in any way a movie would have shown it. No tears, no rush into open arms, none of the easy catharsis Laura might have hoped for if she'd let herself hope at all. But Era's small hand tightened on the bear, not in alarm this time, but in something closer to pride. And when Laura finally glanced up and met her eyes directly, the girl didn't immediately look away. It was, Laura thought, the longest unbroken eye contact the household had offered her since she'd arrived. The first real crack in the house's careful machinery came 8 days later, on a Tuesday, with almost no warning at all. Laura had been wandering. There wasn't a kinder word for it. She had too much unstructured time and a house too large to fill it in, when she heard the particular hush that fell over a household right before something it dreaded. Ji-Yun moving fast and silent through the hallway. 2 security men repositioning at the elevator instead of the usual one. A tension that arrived in the air before anyone said a word to explain it. "What's happening?" Laura asked, catching Ji-Yun mid-stride. "Director Pak is visiting," Ji-Yun said, in the strained, overly neutral tone of someone choosing words very carefully. "Board member. He likes to check in." "Check in on what?" "On the household." Ji-Yun's eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, toward the hallway leading to Era's nursery. "Please keep Era occupied somewhere he won't see her, if you can. It's easier when he doesn't see her." Laura didn't get the chance. By the time she'd made her way down the hall, Director Pak was already in the main living room. A heavy-set man in his 60s with the particular, glossy self-satisfaction of someone who had never once in his life been told no and meant it. And Era was nowhere in sight, except that Laura could hear, faintly, the sound of a door easing shut somewhere off the hallway, and underneath it, breathing. Quick. Shallow. The unmistakable sound of someone trying very hard to disappear. She found her in the linen closet off the nursery hall, wedged between folded towels, knees pulled to her chest, bare crushed against her face like a shield against the world. She wasn't crying. That was somehow worse than if she had been. She was simply very, very still, the practiced stillness of a child who had learned that stillness was the only form of safety available to her. "Hey," Laura whispered, crouching down slowly, not reaching for her, just lowering herself to the girl's eye level and staying there. "Hey, it's just me." Era's eyes found her over the top of the bear's head. Wide, wet, though no tears had actually fallen yet. Terrified in a way that had nothing childish about it. The specific, calibrated fear of someone who understood, on some level too young to have words for it, that there were people in her life who wanted to hurt her, and that this man's voice carrying faintly down the hallway belonged to one of them. "You don't have to come out," Laura said quietly. "I'll just sit right here with you until he's gone." "Okay." She didn't try to hold her. She didn't try to talk her into bravery she didn't feel, or perform the kind of forced cheerfulness adults so often inflicted on frightened children in the name of comfort. She just sat down on the closet floor, back against the shelf of towels, close enough that Era could feel another body in the small dark space if she needed to, far enough that nothing was forced. After a long moment, something shifted. Era's death grip on the bear loosened by degrees. And then, slowly, like an animal deciding a hand wasn't a trap, she leaned, just slightly, until her small shoulder rested against Laura's arm. They sat like that for almost 20 minutes, until the murmur of Director Pack's voice faded from the living room, until the elevator chimed somewhere distant, until the apartment exhaled the particular silence that meant a threat had left the building. Only then did Era speak, not in words, not yet, but in a small, hiccuping sigh of release. The sound a body makes when it finally stops bracing for something that didn't, this time, happen. Laura didn't tell anyone what she'd seen in that closet. Not Ji-yun, not the guards, not, for the moment, Sean Cal. It felt like something that belonged to her and Era alone. The first secret in a house that apparently ran entirely on secrets, except this one she intended to keep for the girl's sake rather than against her. But she understood, sitting in that linen closet with a 4-year-old's heartbeat slowing against her arm, that whatever danger this family lived inside of was not theoretical, was not boardroom abstraction, was not something that lived only in legal documents and corporate maneuvering. It had a face. It had a voice that could make a child hide in a closet rather than be seen. And Laura realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was no longer thinking about the $10 million at all. She was thinking about what it would take to make sure no one ever made that little girl hide again. It was almost 3 weeks into the arrangement when Laura found the file, and she would spend a long time afterward wondering whether "found" was even the right word, since what actually happened was closer to an accident wearing the disguise of curiosity. Era had taken, in the past week, to a small but real ritual. She would sit with Laura most mornings now, no longer mute exactly, though her words came rare and small, offered like coins she wasn't sure she could spare. She liked to draw. She liked, specifically, to draw on Laura's tablet, which she'd discovered propped on the kitchen counter one morning and had taken an immediate, fierce liking to, dragging her finger across the screen in careful loops while Laura drank her coffee and pretended not to be moved nearly to tears by the simple fact of being trusted with a child's undivided attention. That morning, Era had wandered off mid-drawing, distracted by something Ji-yun was doing in the next room, and left the tablet open on the counter. Laura picked it up to put it away and noticed, without quite meaning to, that one of the open browser tabs wasn't Era's drawing app at all. It was a document viewer, and the document on the screen was not a children's coloring template. It was titled, in stark corporate shorthand, KH_internal, Marriage Validity Assessment, Restricted. Laura's first instinct was to close it immediately, the reflexive guilt of someone caught looking at something private. Her second instinct, arriving about 2 seconds later and considerably louder, was that this had absolutely nothing to do with Era's tablet history and everything to do with the fact that someone, somewhere, had access to this household's internal network well enough to push files onto a 4-year-old's drawing app, whether by mistake or by some kind of automatic sync she didn't understand, or by something far less innocent. She read it before she could talk herself out of it. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It was a memo, clinical, bloodless, written in the specific dead language of corporate legal strategy, outlining a plan to compile evidence demonstrating that the marriage between Sean Cal and the American national, L. Penn, lacked the legal substance required to satisfy succession bylaws on the grounds of insufficient cohabitation, absence of documented prior relationship, and financial consideration inconsistent with a genuine marital union. There was a list: surveillance access points, network logs, a line, and this was the one that made Laura's stomach drop straight through the floor, referencing household device telemetry secured via existing internal access. Someone inside Cal Holdings was watching this apartment from the inside. Not guessing, not speculating from press photos and gossip. Watching devices, network traffic, the digital exhaust of everyday life, and building a case, methodically, to prove in front of a board that her marriage was exactly what it actually was: fake. Laura sat very still at the kitchen counter for a long moment, the tablet warm in her hands, feeling the specific vertigo of having just learned that the danger in this house wasn't only outside the walls. It was inside the network, inside the routers, the smart devices, the very tablet a 4-year-old used to draw pictures of her bear. She thought about Director Pack's glossy, untroubled face. She thought about the closet and the small body pressed against her arm, and the particular calibrated terror of a child who already understood, on some animal level, exactly how much danger she was in. And she thought, they're not just trying to expose a fake marriage. They're building a case to take her. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark running the memo's language over and over, trying to decide what to do with knowledge she wasn't sure she'd been meant to have, in a house where she still didn't entirely know who to trust. Min Hee Cho had drafted the contract. Min Hee Cho would, presumably, know exactly what kind of evidence would or wouldn't hold up against it. The thought arrived, and she pushed it away because it felt too large to hold at 3 in the morning, and because she had absolutely nothing yet to support it beyond a feeling she couldn't fully justify. What she did know, with total certainty, was that Sean Cal needed to see what she'd seen. Tonight, if she could manage it. Whatever fragile, careful distance still existed between them. Whatever rules this house ran on that she'd been told not to ask too loudly about. None of it mattered anymore measured against the fact that someone was actively, methodically building a legal weapon aimed directly at his daughter. She found him exactly where she'd half expected to. In his office, past midnight, door uncharacteristically unlocked, lights spilling into the hallway in a single accusing stripe. He looked up when she knocked, and something in his face, the immediate, total alertness, the way his hand had already moved half an inch toward the phone on his desk before he registered it was her, told her he'd been waiting for bad news for so long that he'd stopped distinguishing the waiting from the living. "It's late," he said, but he was already straightening, already reading something in her expression that she hadn't said a word to produce yet. "I need to show you something." She set the tablet on his desk, screen still open to the document, and watched his face as he read it. She had, by now, cataloged most of his expressions, the careful neutrality he wore like armor in front of staff, the rare, brief warmth that surfaced only around Era, the controlled tension that lived permanently in his shoulders. She had not yet seen this one. His face didn't crumble, exactly. It went very, very still, in the particular way of a man absorbing a blow he'd been bracing for so long that the actual impact arrived almost as relief. Confirmation, finally, of the shape of the thing he'd been afraid of. "Where did you find this?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "On Era's tablet. I don't think it was meant to land there. I think someone's syncing files across the household network and made a mistake. Or," she stopped, "or it wasn't a mistake at all. And I'm not supposed to know that you have a network problem this serious." He sat down slowly, like his legs had simply decided, of their own accord, that standing was no longer sustainable. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, staring at the document with the specific exhaustion of a man who had clearly been fighting this exact war alone, in silence, for far longer than 3 weeks. How long have you known, Laura asked quietly, that someone inside your own company is doing this? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the careful, distant formality he usually wrapped around himself like a second skin. Since before you signed the contract. He looked up at her, and the cold Tycoon from the boardroom, the guarded king at the window, was nowhere in his face at all anymore. What was left looked simply like a frightened father, several years into a war he wasn't winning. I told you in the beginning, the contract wasn't about the board's comfort. It was never about optics, or shareholders, or any of the language he uses to make this sound like ordinary business. Then what was it about? My wife. His hands, flat on the desk, were not entirely steady. My late wife, Era's mother. She died 2 years ago, officially an accident. Unofficially, he stopped himself, visibly, like a man pulling back from the edge of saying something he'd decided long ago never to say out loud. There are people on my own board who would benefit enormously from declaring me unfit to run this company. People who have spent 2 years building exactly the kind of legal architecture necessary to take my daughter out of my custody and put her, and her shares, because she inherits a controlling interest the day she turns 18, somewhere they can control. Laura felt the floor of her understanding shift entirely. You didn't marry me to satisfy a board. You married me because you needed someone the board couldn't claim was already compromised. I needed an outsider. His voice had dropped to something rawer than she'd heard from him yet. Someone with no ties to the company, no history with the family, no possible angle for them to claim collusion. Someone who would actually be in the apartment with her, actually present, actually paying attention. Because for 2 years the only people legally permitted near my daughter have been employees, and employees can be bought, replaced, or silenced, and I was running out of people I could be certain weren't already someone else's. And you didn't tell me any of this before I signed. Would you have believed me? It wasn't an accusation. It was, she realized, a genuine question, asked by a man who had clearly run this exact calculation 100 times before he ever sat across from her in that boardroom. A stranger walks in off a financial crisis, and I tell her my dead wife's enemies are trying to take my 4-year-old because she's worth more to them as a shareholder than as a person who needs a mother. You'd have run. He wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. I'm not running now, Laura said. But I need you to stop deciding, alone, what I can and can't handle. I found a memo on a tablet by accident, Shankal. By accident. If I hadn't picked it up to put it away, I wouldn't know any of this. And meanwhile, they've already got network access. They're already building a file. And you're sitting here at midnight carrying all of it by yourself like that's somehow safer for anyone. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. The way he had once in the boardroom. The way he had in the kitchen the night he'd promised her breakfast with his daughter. And something in his face finally, fully gave way. Her name was Soo-Yun, he said quietly. My wife. She knew, before she died, that the board would come for Era eventually. She set aside money outside the company's reach specifically to make this possible, to bring in someone they couldn't trace, couldn't buy, couldn't claim was already on their payroll. I didn't tell you that either. What else haven't you told me? That I don't know who inside this house is feeding them information. He said it flatly, like a confession that had been sitting in his chest so long it had calcified. It could be the network administrator. It could be one of the household staff. It could be, he stopped himself again. But this time Laura saw exactly where the sentence had been headed, saw the shape of the suspicion he hadn't let himself say out loud yet, and felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the late hour. It could be Minnie, Laura finished for him quietly. Your own lawyer. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He simply sat there, in the half-dark of his office, looking like a man who had spent 2 years being afraid of exactly this moment. Not the moment the threat arrived, but the moment he finally had to stop carrying it alone, and said, very softly, in a voice that sounded nothing at all like the cold Tycoon who'd stood at a boardroom window 3 weeks ago. I need your help. Not as a contract. Not as a wife on paper. He met her eyes, and there was nothing guarded left in his face at all. As someone who's already sat on the floor of a linen closet with my daughter and made her feel safe, I need that person, not the $10 million. Her. Outside, soul burned on in its thousand small lights, indifferent and enormous. And somewhere down the hall, a 4-year-old slept with a one-eyed bear clutched against her chest, unaware that the two adults responsible for her safety had just, finally, stopped pretending to each other that any of this was simple. Laura didn't know yet how deep the rod in this company went, or how far Minhee Cho's betrayal, if that's what it was, actually reached, or what it would cost any of them before this was over. But she knew, sitting across from a desperate father at midnight in a glass tower full of secrets, that whatever she'd signed 3 weeks ago in that boardroom, it wasn't a contract anymore. It hadn't been for a while. The plan, when it finally took shape, was Laura's idea, though she would later insist, whenever Shankal tried to credit her with more cleverness than she felt she deserved, that she'd only said the obvious thing out loud first. If they're watching the network, she said, 2 days after the midnight confession in his office, sitting across from him at a kitchen table that had, for the first time since she'd arrived, started to feel less like a hotel and more like a place two people actually talk to each other. Then stop trying to keep them out. Feed them something instead. Something specific enough to be convincing. Something that, if they act on it, proves exactly who's watching. Shankal had looked at her for a long moment, the particular look she was starting to recognize as the one he wore when he was recalculating someone's worth in real time. You want to bait them. I want to catch them in the act of doing the thing they're already doing. There's a difference between suspecting someone's leaking information and watching them leak a piece of information you planted yourself, specifically, so it could only have come from one place. He'd brought in his head of security the next morning, a broad, quiet man named Director June, who had the unhurried watchfulness of someone who'd spent a career assuming the worst about everyone and being right often enough to keep doing it. June listened to the idea with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, and when Laura finished, he said only, "Who has access to the calendar system?" It turned out to be a useful question. The household ran on a shared digital calendar. Appointments, deliveries, Era's tutoring schedule, security shift rotations, synced across several devices and, crucially, visible to a small list of people outside the apartment itself. Jian, 2 members of the household staff, the building's security office, and Minhee Cho, who maintained access in her professional capacity as the family's attorney of record. "We build a calendar entry," Laura said, the plan sharpening as she spoke it out loud. "Something that looks routine on its surface but is actually bait. A private outing. Someplace specific at a specific time, framed as low security, easy access, minimal protection, the kind of opportunity someone watching for a moment of vulnerability would jump at." June's eyes narrowed slightly, the first real interest he'd shown. "And we increase security at the real location without ever entering it into any shared system. 2 truths. One for whoever's watching, one for us." "Exactly." Shankal had gone very still, listening, his hand wrapped loosely around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. "You're proposing we use my daughter as bait?" "No," Laura said, sharper than she'd meant to, and then, more carefully, "I'm proposing we use the idea of your daughter as bait. She doesn't leave this apartment. Not once, not for a second, during any part of this. We create an entry that says she will be somewhere, a children's museum, a private swim lesson, whatever's plausible, and then we make absolutely sure she's nowhere near it, double-guarded, the whole time the trap is open. If someone moves on the false location, we don't just confirm there's a leak. We see exactly who shows up and exactly how fast they got the information, which tells us exactly how it traveled." It took June less than a minute to start nodding, slow and deliberate, the way a man nods when a plan offends his caution slightly less than the alternative of doing nothing. Shankal looked, for a long moment, like a father weighing the unbearable math of risking nothing against gaining nothing, and then he set his coffee cup down with the particular finality of a decision made. "If there is even one variable we can't control," he said, "we stop. Immediately. No further negotiation." Agreed, Laura said, and meant it. They built it carefully over 4 days, with a precision that felt almost absurd given how small the actual lie was. A swim lesson, entered into the shared calendar under Era's name, at a private aquatic facility across the city, real enough to check out, exclusive enough to explain light security, scheduled for a Thursday afternoon when Sean Cal would ordinarily be in back-to-back board calls and unable, plausibly, to personally accompany his daughter. June arranged for two of his most trusted men, vetted personally, men who had worked for the family since before Soo-Yun's death, men whose loyalty he staked his own reputation on, to be visibly present at drop-off and pickup at the facility, performing the role of a real, if minimal, security detail. He arranged, separately and far more quietly, for a second team to watch the facility's perimeter from a distance, unseen, while Era herself spent that entire Thursday afternoon in the penthouse with Laura, 2 floors of actual security around her, doing absolutely nothing more dangerous than finishing a puzzle of a cartoon dinosaur on the living room floor. Laura sat with her through most of it, half her attention on the puzzle, half on her phone, where June had set up a discrete channel to relay updates in real time. Facility secure. No unusual activity. 2 vehicles parked outside, neither flagged. 40 minutes of nothing. Era, oblivious to the elaborate machinery operating on her behalf, methodically clicked a dinosaur's tail into place and demanded, in the small, precise English she'd been gathering like a horde over the past weeks, that Laura admire it. "It's a beautiful dinosaur," Laura told her, and meant it more than the moment probably warranted, because some part of her brain was running an entirely separate calculation. Please let this work. Please let nobody come. Please let her never have to know how close any of this got. And the contrast between the two things happening in her chest at once felt almost unbearable. At the 53-minute mark, the message came through that changed everything. Unmarked vehicle, facility rear entrance. 2 individuals, unauthorized. Attempted access via staff door. Identified. 1 matches known contractor for Pack Logistics Solutions. Laura's stomach dropped even as her face stayed carefully neutral for Era's sake. Pack Logistics Solutions. Director Pack, the man whose voice alone had once sent a 4-year-old into hiding in a linen closet, operating, apparently, through a logistics shell company with absolutely no obvious reason to send unauthorized contractors to a children's swim facility, unless that facility's calendar entry had reached him through a channel never meant to leave the household. Hold position, June's next message read. Do not engage. Documenting only. It took another 11 minutes. 11 minutes that felt, to Laura, considerably longer than the entire rest of the afternoon combined, before the final update arrived. Subjects departed. Full documentation obtained. Vehicle, faces, badge attempt at staff entrance using falsified maintenance credentials. Confirmed connection to Pack. She didn't tell Sean Cal over text. She waited until his board call ended, until he came striding into the living room with the particular urgency of a man who had spent the entire afternoon only half present in his own meeting, and she simply turned her phone toward him and let him read it himself. He read it twice. His jaw worked once. The only outward sign of the storm she suspected was happening underneath. Pack, he said quietly. Not subtle, in the end. Predictable, even. Predictable enough that the calendar entry alone got him moving, Laura said. Which means he had access to it almost immediately. Which means it didn't travel slowly through some general leak, Sean Cal finished, the realization landing visibly across his face. It went directly, fast, to someone with both the authority and the urgency to mobilize contractors within hours of an entry being created. That's not a household staff member skimming gossip. That's someone close to the legal infrastructure of this. Someone who would know exactly how to read a calendar entry as an opportunity and exactly who to call. Neither of them said the name out loud yet. They didn't need to. It hung in the room between them, unspoken and entirely understood. The same name that had sat heavy in the air of Sean Cal's office 2 weeks earlier when he'd first admitted he didn't know who inside his own walls was feeding the enemy. They needed proof. Not suspicion. Proof specific enough to survive a board, a courtroom, the press, proof that would hold even against someone who had spent her entire career drafting the very documents designed to make accusations like this disappear. So they built a second trap. Smaller, sharper. This time, the false information wasn't placed on the shared calendar at all. It was placed in a single document, drafted by Sean Cal himself, discussing a fictional, urgent revision to the marriage contract's custody provisions in the event of his incapacitation, and shared with exactly one person outside the household, Min-hee Cho, in her professional capacity as drafting attorney, under the explicit, written instruction that the matter remained strictly confidential pending his final review. No one else saw that document. Not June, not Ji-yun, not Laura. Technically, though she knew its contents because Sean Cal had shown her before sending it, his hands steady in a way that told her this particular trap cost him something different than the first one had. This one wasn't bait dangled in front of a stranger's contractor. This one was a test of someone he had, at some point, trusted enough to draft the paper that bound his entire family's future. 3 days later, the document's fictional contents, word for word, clause for clause, language no one outside that single email could possibly have reproduced, surfaced inside an internal Cal Holdings board memo, forwarded by an anonymous account to 4 hostile directors, framed as evidence that Sean Cal himself was attempting to unilaterally alter custody provisions without board oversight. Proof, the memo argued, that the marriage and its surrounding arrangements were a unilateral fabrication designed to consolidate his daughter's shares under his sole control. June traced the forwarding account's metadata within 6 hours. It led, through 3 layers of obfuscation that nearly anyone else would have found impenetrable, to a personal device registered under Min-hee Cho's own household network. There was no version of this where it had happened by accident. The confrontation happened in Sean Cal's office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, with June standing silent and immovable by the door and Laura seated, deliberately, beside Sean Cal rather than apart from him, a choice she'd made on purpose because she wanted whoever walked through that door to see, immediately, exactly how thoroughly their plan to expose this marriage as a fiction had failed. Min-hee Cho arrived precisely on time, as she always did, her chin-length bob immaculate, her black blazer pressed into the same architectural sharpness it had worn the day Laura signed the contract. She took one look at the room, Sean Cal's stillness, June's positioning, the careful, deliberate way Laura sat with her hands folded, and something behind her eyes recalculated instantly. The way Laura imagined a chess player's expression changed the moment they recognized, 3 moves too late, that they'd been the one being maneuvered all along. "You wanted to discuss the custody revision," she said, her voice as level and unhurried as it had been the night Laura signed away a year of her life. "I assume that's why I'm here." "There was no custody revision," Sean Cal said. The silence that followed had weight to it. Min-hee's expression didn't crack. Laura had to give her that. Even now, even watching the woman's careful machinery grind through the realization that she'd walked directly into the center of her own exposure. But something in her posture shifted, fractionally, the particular stillness of someone calculating exits. "I don't understand," Min-hee said, which was, Laura thought, the first genuinely unconvincing thing she'd ever heard the woman say. "The document was fabricated," Sean Cal said, specifically, deliberately, and shared with exactly one person. "You forwarded its contents, word for word, to 4 board members hostile to my custody of my own daughter." Director June traced the transmission to a device on your home network 3 days ago. "I've had 3 days to decide what to do with that information, and I decided I wanted to give you the chance to explain it to my face before I decided anything further." For a long moment, Min-hee said nothing at all, and then, almost imperceptibly, something in her shoulders dropped. Not surrender exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who had been performing a role so long that holding the performance had become its own kind of labor, and who had just been given permission, however unwillingly, to stop. "You don't know what they have on me," she said quietly. It wasn't an apology. It was, Laura realized with a chill, something closer to a confession of a different kind entirely, not of guilt, but of leverage. You think I did this for money? For ambition? I drafted contracts for this company for 11 years, Sean Cal. I watched what happened to your wife. You think I don't know exactly what these people are capable of? Then tell me, Sean Cal said, his voice dropping into something darker, more dangerous than Laura had heard from him yet. Tell me what they have on you that's worth my daughter's safety. Minhee's composure finally, fully cracked, not into tears, not into the kind of breakdown that might have made the moment simpler, but into something colder and more honest. My brother, she said, 3 years ago, a financial situation I won't bore you with the details of, except to say that it would have ended his career, possibly his freedom, and Director Pack's faction made it disappear in exchange for access. Information. Small things, at first. A meeting schedule. A travel itinerary. It was never supposed to go this far. It was never supposed to involve a child. And yet it did, Laura said quietly, unable to stay silent any longer, for 2 years. While that little girl hid in a closet because hearing one man's voice in the next room was enough to terrify her. While her father carried the entire weight of trying to protect her completely alone, because he couldn't trust the one person whose entire job was supposed to be protecting his family's legal interests. He looked at Laura then, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time since the boardroom, and something in her expression shifted into an emotion Laura hadn't expected at all. Something almost like recognition. You're better at this than I expected, she said. Better than him, even at first. He needed someone who'd actually fight for her. I'll admit, I didn't think he'd find one in 3 weeks. It wasn't an apology. Laura understood, even then, that it never would be. That whatever Minhee Cho had told herself to survive 11 years of complicity, it had hardened into something that no longer recognized the difference between justification and confession. But it was, in its own cold way, an admission, and combined with June's documentation, the forwarded memo, the falsified maintenance credentials at the swim facility, the metadata trail leading directly back to a device in her own home. It was enough. You'll resign, Shankal said. Tonight. And you'll provide a full account of every piece of information you've passed to Pax faction over the past 2 years, in writing, under oath, to my legal counsel. In exchange, I won't pursue criminal charges against your brother's original situation, and I won't make your name part of the public record when this surfaces, and it will surface, Minhee, because I intend to make sure of it. It wasn't mercy exactly. Laura watched Minhee understand that too. Watched her recognize the offer for what it actually was, a trade calculated with the same cold precision she herself had once brought to drafting contracts in this very building. Except this time the precision was being used against her instead of on her behalf. She nodded once. She didn't say thank you. She gathered her things with the same composed, unhurried efficiency she'd brought to every interaction Laura had witnessed her conduct. And at the door, she paused, looking back, not at Sean Cal, but at Laura. Be careful at the gala, she said. Pax faction isn't finished simply because I am. If anything, you've just made me considerably less useful to him at exactly the moment he's most desperate. And then she was gone, and the office felt, in her absence, both lighter and considerably more frightening than it had a moment before. The Cal Holdings International Gala had been scheduled for months before any of this began. An annual fixture, the kind of glittering, photographed obligation that conglomerates performed to remind the world and their shareholders that the empire remained healthy and untouchable. Canceling it now, after Minhee's resignation, would have signaled exactly the kind of internal instability Sean Cal had spent 2 years trying to prevent the board from glimpsing. So they went forward with it, eyes open, fully aware that whatever remained of Pax faction would be watching the event as closely as anyone, looking for the first sign of weakness to exploit. We're not hiding anymore, Sean Cal said, the night before, as Laura stood in front of the mirror in a deep emerald gown that Ji-Yun had produced from somewhere with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had clearly been preparing for this exact moment longer than Laura realized. If they want a public confrontation, we give them one on our terms. Full security, full transparency to the press, the moment anything moves against us. No more shadows. And Era stays with June's most trusted team, in a private suite at the venue, 2 floors away from the main event, with security protocols I designed myself. He met her eyes in the mirror's reflection, and something in his face, even now, even dressed for a war disguised as a party, softened at the mention of his daughter. I won't have her anywhere near the main floor. Not after everything. The gala itself unfolded, for the first hour, exactly the way these events were designed to unfold. Chandeliers, champagne, a ballroom full of the kind of wealth that existed mainly to be photographed existing. 100 conversations conducted in the specific, performative warmth of people who would happily destroy each other given sufficient incentive. Laura moved through it on Sean Cal's arm, aware of cameras, aware of the particular currency of being seen, aware that every smile she offered a board member or a journalist was itself a kind of armor. She felt it before she understood it. A wrongness in the room's rhythm, a stutter in the ambient hum of conversation that didn't belong. Across the ballroom, near the south entrance, she caught Director Pack's eyes finding hers, and unlike every other interaction of the evening, he didn't look away when she met his gaze. He held it, deliberately, the way a man holds eye contact right before doing something he wants you to know was intentional. The lights went out 4 seconds later. Not a flicker, not a brownout. Total, immediate darkness, the kind that swallowed an entire ballroom of 400 people in a single heartbeat, followed by the specific, rising chaos of panic given just enough darkness to spread unsupervised. Someone screamed. Glass shattered somewhere near the bar. Laura felt Sean Cal's hand close around her wrist, hard, and heard him say, low and fast, directly against her ear, Era. Now. They moved together through the dark, against the tide of panicking bodies, toward the service corridor that led to the private suites. And it was there, in the chaos of the corridor, lit only by the dim emergency strips along the floor, that they were separated. A surge of fleeing guests cut directly between them, and Laura felt Sean Cal's grip tear loose from her wrist, heard him shout her name once into the dark, and then lost him entirely in the crush of bodies moving the wrong direction. She didn't stop to look for him. She had one thought, total and absolute, cutting through every other instinct. Get to Era. She found the private suite's hallway by memory and instinct more than sight. The emergency lighting barely enough to navigate by, her heart slamming hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The guard who should have been posted outside the suite door was gone. Not dead. She would learn later, only knocked unconscious, dragged into a side alcove with brutal efficiency, and the door itself stood ajar, light spilling weakly from inside. 2 men were already in the room. Laura didn't think. She moved on something far older and more animal than thought, grabbing the heavy iron base of a decorative lamp from the hallway console and swinging it with everything she had into the back of the nearer man's shoulder, hard enough to drop him to one knee with a roar of surprised pain. The second man turned, and in the half-second before he closed the distance, Laura saw, past his shoulder, Era pressed into the farthest corner of the room, eyes enormous, bare clutched against her chest, frozen in the specific terror of a child who understood, with total clarity, exactly what was happening to her. The second man lunged. Laura threw herself sideways into the heavy suite door, slamming it half shut on his arm, buying herself one precious second to grab the small side table beside it and wedge it under the handle with shaking hands. Not a real barricade, not against 2 grown men determined enough, but enough, maybe, for a few crucial seconds. Laura. Era's voice, small, hoarse, barely more than a whisper, the first sound Laura had ever heard her make above a murmur, cut through the chaos, and Laura spun toward her, already moving to shield her with her own body, bracing for the door to give way behind her. The man Laura had struck with the lamp recovered enough to shove the door open again, the makeshift barricade scattering uselessly across the floor, and for one terrible, suspended moment Laura understood that there was no version of this where she could physically overpower 2 grown men determined to take a child out of this room. So she did the only thing left. She put herself directly between Era and the door, arms spread, voice shaking but absolutely steady in its refusal. "You are not touching her." The man reached for her anyway, and that was the moment Era screamed. It wasn't a child's frightened cry. It tore out of her with a force that seemed almost too large for her small body. A single, raw, desperate word. The very first word Laura had heard her speak in nearly 4 weeks of careful silence. "Daddy." It echoed down the corridor with a clarity that cut straight through the chaos of the blacked-out gala, straight through the panic and the shouting and the distant crash of overturned tables, and somewhere not nearly far enough away, but close enough. Laura heard it land. Heard, an instant later, the sound of a man's voice answering it, raw and frantic and absolutely certain, tearing through the dark toward them with a speed that suggested he'd stopped caring entirely about his own safety the moment he heard his daughter's voice for the first time in 2 years. Shankal hit the doorway like something unleashed. What happened next blurred, afterward, into something Laura would only ever remember in fragments. The sickening crack of a fist connecting, the second man's surprised shout, as June's security team flooded the corridor behind Shankal with flashlights, and the particular controlled violence of trained men who had been waiting 2 years for exactly this moment of legal justification. The first man, the one Laura had struck with the lamp, was on the ground and restrained within seconds. The second went down harder, and Laura would later learn, with a complicated mixture of relief and something that wasn't quite guilt, that Shankal himself had thrown the punch that ended it. The first genuinely violent thing she'd ever seen him do, executed with the precise, controlled fury of a father whose restraint had simply, finally, run out. The lights came back on less than 90 seconds later, the building's backup systems engaging, the gala's chaos resolving into the considerably more orderly chaos of 400 guests blinking in confusion at the sudden return of light, security flooding every entrance, and somewhere in the middle of it, completely unconcerned with any of the spectacle, Shankal on his knees in the wrecked suite, arms wrapped around his daughter, Laura's hand still resting protectively on the girl's shoulder, all three of them breathing hard in the wreckage of a room that had nearly become a kidnapping. "You spoke," Shankal said into Era's hair, his voice breaking apart entirely. 2 years of careful composure dissolving into something raw and unguarded and human. "Era, you spoke." "I was scared for Laura," Era whispered, her voice small and shaking but entirely, unmistakably present, no longer hidden behind silence. "I didn't want them to hurt her." Laura felt something break open in her own chest, something she'd been holding rigid for weeks without entirely realizing it. Relief and fear's slow retreat, and something else underneath both of those, something that didn't have a clean name yet, but felt suspiciously like love. By the time security had the two enforcers in custody, by the time the International Press Corps, present in full force for the gala, and now witnessing something considerably more dramatic than they'd come for, began documenting the scene with the specific, ravenous attention of journalists who understood they'd stumbled onto the story of the year. Director Pack had already been identified leaving the venue through a service exit, his face captured clearly on no fewer than 4 separate cameras, his connection to the unconscious guard, the unauthorized intruders, and the venue's sabotage power grid laid out with a clarity that no amount of corporate legal maneuvering would ever be able to fully bury. Shankal stood. Finally, Era still held tight against his chest, and faced the gathering crowd of press and shareholders and stunned board members with the particular, devastating calm of a man who had spent 2 years being underestimated and had just run entirely out of patience for it. "My daughter," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the recovering ballroom, "was nearly taken tonight by men working for Director Pack in an attempt to seize control of this company by destroying my family. I have evidence, financial, digital, and now physical, implicating him and several of his allies on this board in a 2-year campaign of corporate sabotage and attempted kidnapping. That evidence will be in the hands of the appropriate authorities within the hour." He paused, and his free hand found Laura's, gripping it with a fierceness that needed no further explanation to anyone watching. "And in case there was ever any doubt remaining among any of you about the nature of my marriage, There isn't. Not anymore. There never really was. It wasn't, Laura would think later, the kind of declaration she'd ever imagined receiving. Not roses, not candlelight, but a billionaire standing in the wreckage of an attempted kidnapping, his daughter's first words in 2 years still hanging in the air, declaring to a room full of reporters and enemies that whatever this had started as, it had stopped being fake a long time ago. She found, in that moment, that she didn't need it to be anything more romantic than that. It was, in its own way, exactly enough. The weeks that followed moved with the strange, accelerated clarity of a storm finally breaking after months of pressure building. Director Pack was arrested within 48 hours, the evidence against him, corroborated, in the end, by Min Hee-cho's own sworn account, delivered exactly as promised, in exchange for the leniency Sean Cal had offered, comprehensive enough that even his most loyal allies on the board scrambled to distance themselves before the scandal could reach them too. 3 other directors resigned within the month, their own complicity surfacing in pieces as investigators pulled apart 2 years of carefully laundered information trails. Cal Holdings' stock dipped briefly, violently, in the immediate aftermath, and then recovered, climbing higher than it had stood in years, buoyed by a public that had, against every cynical expectation, fallen completely in love with the story of a tycoon who'd nearly lost everything protecting his daughter and the woman who'd fought beside him to do it. None of that, Laura would think later, was the part that actually mattered. The part that mattered happened 3 weeks after the gala, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in the penthouse that had slowly, almost without her noticing the transition, stopped feeling like a museum and started feeling like a home. Era was asleep down the hall, speaking now, in small but steadily growing sentences, the silence of 2 years unwinding itself a little more each day, like a knot finally given permission to loosen. Jiyeon had gone for the night. The apartment held the particular, comfortable quiet of a place where everyone inside it finally felt safe enough to stop bracing. Sean Cal found Laura in the living room, looking out at the same skyline that had framed him the night she signed the contract, and set something down on the table between them. The original document, the one with the bold block letters across its cover sheet, the $10 million, the careful clauses designed to make a fiction look legally airtight. "I've been thinking about this," he said, since the gala, "about what it actually means now for either of us. It means I helped you survive a board war and got paid generously for it," Laura said, though even as she said it, the words felt thinner than they once would have, hollow in a way they hadn't been 3 weeks ago, when the contract was still the truest thing between them. "It means," Sean Cal said quietly, "that I signed a piece of paper telling the world we were married, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, without either of us deciding to, it stopped being a lie." He picked up the contract, weighed it once in his hands, the way she remembered weighing the pen on the night she'd signed it. "I don't want this anymore. Not as the reason we're together." He tore it, not dramatically, not in some single satisfying rip down the center, methodically, page by page, the same careful precision he brought to everything, until the desk was covered in scattered fragments of clauses and provisions and 10 million carefully negotiated dollars, none of it meaning anything anymore. "I'm not offering you a renegotiated contract," he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, standing rigid and guarded at a boardroom window, his voice carried no caution in it at all. "I'm asking you to stay because Era asked me, this morning, if you were going to be her mom even after the year was over. And because I've spent 2 years being afraid to need anyone, and somehow, in 3 months, you became the one person in this building I don't have to be afraid in front of." He paused, and something almost like uncertainty crossed his face, the first uncertainty she'd seen from him since the gala, the kind that belonged to a man asking for something he genuinely wasn't sure he deserved. "I'm asking if you'll stay. Not for the money, not for a clause, for exactly what it looks like, a real marriage, a real family, with absolutely nothing written down to make either of us keep it." Laura looked at the scattered fragments of the contract across the table, $10 million in shredded paper, a debt to her family already paid in full, a legal fiction that had somehow, somewhere between a linen closet and a blacked-out ballroom, become the realest thing she'd ever signed her name to. She thought of her mother, finally, fully out from under the weight of medical bills. She thought of a 4-year-old's first word in 2 years, screamed down a dark hallway to save her. She thought of a man who had stood rigid and unreachable at a window the night they met, and who now sat across from her with nothing guarded left in his face at all. "No more clauses," she said softly, and reached across the table to take his hand. "Just us." Outside, Seoul burned on in its thousand small lights. The same skyline that had once framed a stranger's desperate gamble, now simply the view from a home that finally, completely, belonged to all three of them. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. We drop interesting stories like this every week.